Pollen and Peril. The Fossick Lane Mysteries. Book 3. By Wynne Valentine. Copyright 2026 by Wynne Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. Chapter 1. The First Bloom. Spring arrived in Crabapple Bend the way it always did. Suddenly, as though the town had been holding its breath and finally remembered to exhale. One day the coast was gray and sharp with salt wind. The next, everything had turned tender. The crabapple tree in the town square burst into such extravagant bloom that even Desmond Crisp seemed unsettled when he mentioned it over coffee at the Fossick. Neither good nor bad, he'd said. Oracle, the ancient tortoise, tucked under his arm like a weathered handbag. Just emphatic. I'd nodded and wrapped another bundle of festival supplies in brown paper, this one destined for the Grange Hall's committee room. The Tide Pool Festival was Crabapple Bend's biggest event, 3 days of ceremony and celebration that coincided with the spring tide. Tourists came, locals worked. Magic hummed louder than usual, drawn by the convergence of tide, season, and collective intention. The festival prep had consumed the shop for weeks. I'd reorganized the apothecary section twice, moving the spring herbs to the front: borage, sweet cicely, the tender new growth of nettle that Jenna Whitmore had foraged from the foothills. The curio side needed inventory management. People wanted specific items for the festival's various rituals. Some wanted protection talismans. Others sought things of historical significance. A few wanted to trade their own peculiar finds for something that felt more aligned with who they were becoming as the seasons turned. My shop was doing exceptional business. The past 6 months since I arrived in autumn had transformed the Fossick from a struggling curiosity into something people actually visited on purpose. The apothecary section moved steadily. The curio side had developed a reputation. People trusted my eye for the peculiar and personally meaningful. B at Petra Coffee had started recommending customers to me, sending them across the square with specific requests. Teddy will know what you need, she'd told people. Even Sheriff Restrepo had stopped in twice, ostensibly for supplies, but mostly to be friendly, to check that I was settling in well. That afternoon, before the first hints of trouble, I'd met Bea at Petra Coffee. The cafe was her creation, a space that smelled perpetually of espresso and the particular warmth that came from someone who understood the alchemy of combining good coffee with genuine human attention. She'd ordered my regular without asking, which was how I knew I'd been in town long enough to have a regular. The realization had made me absurdly happy. The crabapple tree is going to be extraordinary this year, Bea had said, settling onto the stool across from me. Her familiar, Confetti the sugar glider, was doing lazy circles around the sugar containers. It's like the tree knows something the rest of us are still learning. Trees are always dramatic, I'd said. It's their nature. Maybe that's a good thing, Bea had said. Maybe the drama is what keeps things interesting, what keeps us paying attention. And then there was Nolan. Harbor Master Nolan Voss had evolved from a kind of professional irritation into something I hadn't quite named. We weren't friends, not exactly, but we'd developed a rhythm. He'd appear with coffee or supplies from the harbor for the shop. Once he'd brought me bottles of sea glass he'd collected. Another time, a chart of the tidal patterns that he thought might interest my curious nature. I'd show him new acquisitions, pointing out the curious angles of things, the way certain objects seem to hold stories in their surfaces. When we worked committee preparations together, we were both on the Tide Pool Festival Committee, we moved around each other like people who'd learned the same dance, anticipating movements, filling silences with comfortable presence. There was an undercurrent, unmistakable. Neither of us acknowledged it. "You're distracted," Quill said, his observation arriving as a feeling burst of orange annoyance mixed with something like amusement. My familiar, an African pygmy hedgehog with the temperament of a tiny critic, had developed strong opinions about Nolan's frequent appearances. Quill had a particular way of letting me know when he considered something beneath notice, and equally particular ways of approving when humans showed promise. I didn't argue. My hands kept losing grip on the paper. I wrapped another bundle, candles this time, hand-poured from beeswax I'd sourced from Jenna Whitmore's place in the foothills. The bees there were magic-touched. The wax held a faint luminescence that showed up in candlelight. People loved them. They sold as soon as I stocked them. Quill hopped onto the counter, his nose working at the air. The tiny hedgehog's dark eyes fixed on the shop window, toward the distant tree line. The brackenwood was visible from here, a wall of green that seemed to breathe with its own weather. It was a self-rearranging forest, one of the town's weirder features, and magic-touched enough that most people avoided it unless there was specific reason. Locals knew its moods, understood when to stay clear. The forest had boundaries, but they shifted. "What is it?" I asked, following his focus. His nose continued twitching, that particular intensity that meant he'd caught something significant. The brackenwood looked the same as always, dense, shadowed, impossibly old. But something in Quill's body language suggested he disagreed. He'd gone very still, a posture he only adopted when he'd detected something that required serious attention. The tree line had shifted, just slightly. Just enough that the boundary I'd been looking at for 6 months seemed marginally different from what I remembered. Where there had been dense growth, now there was a subtle opening. Not an invitation, the forest didn't invite people in, but a drawing inward, a reorganization. I stared harder, trying to convince myself I was wrong. Quill sent another burst, certainty, concern, and underneath it, something almost like warning. His spines bristled, tiny nubs rising across his body in a way that made him seem larger than his actual size. "You might be onto something," I murmured, and made a mental note to mention it to Desmond. If the brackenwood was rearranging itself, that was significant. Self-rearranging was its default state, but it usually happened slowly, incrementally. The changes typically took weeks, even months. Sudden shifts meant something had changed. Something had triggered the forest's deeper attention. I wrapped my last bundle of festival supplies, set them aside for pickup, and stood in the quiet of my shop. Outside, the harbor was visible in the distance, the way Nolan moved through it like he was born from salt water and tidal force. The town was ready for celebration. The weather was perfect. The magic was aligned. The festival was tomorrow. Everything was in place. I had no idea that by tomorrow evening, the brackenwood would have created a barrier no one expected. That we'd find Aldous Fenn dead inside it, sitting peaceful against a tree like someone who'd simply decided to rest forever. And that I'd spend the next week unraveling how poison and magic and human intention had woven together to wound the very binding that held Crabapple Bend intact. But Quill knew. On some level that hedgehogs understood and humans hadn't learned yet, my familiar had sensed the shift in the town's magical baseline. He'd felt the approach of something that would change everything. And he'd been trying to warn me in the way that small creatures warned their humans, with insistent attention and feeling bursts that didn't quite translate into language, but carried absolute certainty. I would remember that moment later. Standing in my shop, Quill on my lap, looking out at the brackenwood and the crabapple tree in full bloom, completely unaware that Crabapple Bend's safety hung by threads that someone was actively cutting. Unaware that the next 3 weeks would consume my entire focus and force me to confront not just a murderer, but a philosophy that challenged everything the town had built itself on. Chapter 2. The Forest's Secret. The discovery didn't happen the way they happen in stories. There was no scream, no dramatic dash into the woods. Instead, it was Tamsin Odell, nervous and holding a coffee cup with both hands, mentioning to Sheriff Restrepo that nobody could access the Brackenwood Trail. We were setting up for the lantern procession, the first major event of the festival, scheduled for that evening. The trail through the Brackenwood was supposed to be part of the route. Magical, atmospheric, traditional. It made sense. It worked every year. Tourists loved it. Locals loved it. The forest seemed to welcome the ritual, the way the trees glowed when candlelight moved through them, the way the air shifted and sweetened when people walked that path with intention. Except this year, the forest had other plans. Restrepo organized a small search party. Professional, calm. The kind of competence that came from 2 decades wearing a badge in a small town with magical complications. I was included because I was on the committee, and because I'd apparently become the person they called when things were strange. Desmond came because he understood the Brackenwood better than anyone living in town. Nolan joined because the forest touched the harbor's watershed, and harbor master duties extended to anything that affected the town's water magic. The entrance to the trail was sealed. Not physically, there was no wall or gate, but the trees had grown close, impossibly close, their branches interwoven into something impassable. It should have taken weeks to create such a barrier. It had taken overnight. Brackenwood, Nolan said beside me, and I felt the heat of him, the particular way he carried his presence. Water magic and wind magic made him solid in a way I'd never quite accounted for. Sometimes it does this, gets protective. Of what? I asked. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. We pushed deeper. Not easily. Restrepo had to use bolt cutters on what appeared to be branches but felt deliberately placed. The forest was making a point. Behind us, Desmond moved with unusual purpose, oracle visible in the crook of his arm. The tortoise's ancient eyes were fixed forward, as though she could see something the rest of us couldn't. I'd learned not to question Oracle's perceptions. She was older than the town itself. She remembered things that weren't written down anywhere, things that only resided in tortoise-slow memory and the deep knowing that came with centuries of attention. The path grew narrower as we moved deeper. The trees pressed close, their branches creating a tunnel of green and shadow. My heart was beating harder than the physical exertion warranted. Something was wrong in a way that went beyond the visible barrier. The magic felt off, disrupted, like a radio station that couldn't quite find its frequency. The forest opened suddenly, like a held breath released. A clearing that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there but hidden. The trees had formed a perfect ring around it, creating a barrier visible from within and without. It was deliberate, intentional. The forest had made a decision. In the center, sitting with his back against a massive oak, was Aldous Fenn. He'd been the head of the Historical Preservation Committee for 14 years. Mid-60s, though he'd seemed older, the kind of person whose conviction made him seem immovable as the buildings he fought to protect. He sat with his hands folded in his lap. His eyes were closed. His expression suggested peace, which was the most unsettling thing about the whole scene. "Nobody touch anything yet," Restrepo instructed, professional instinct overriding shock. "Desmond, does Oracle have anything?" The tortoise's head swiveled. A long, considering pause. Then Desmond said, "She says the keeping of walls was the wall." I didn't understand that yet. though I would later. Oracle was speaking about the binding itself, the magical architecture that Fenn had spent 14 years trying to preserve in physical form, while something darker had worked to compromise it in magical form. My hand twitched toward the thermos sitting near Fenn's outstretched foot, his festival committee meeting thermos, the blue one with the harbor seal painted on it. A nice touch, a personal touch, something someone might not notice unless they knew what they were looking for. "Teddy, wait!" Restrepo said, but too late. My fingers had brushed it. The reading came through immediate and sharp. Bitterness that wasn't taste but intent. A blended mixture of things I recognized from my apothecary work. Herbs, yes, but specifically chosen for their individual properties and their terrible synergy. Digitalis for the heart. Bloodroot for the intention to destroy. Other things, layered beneath like intention-made botanical. Underneath it all, a coldness so precise it felt almost clinical. And underneath that, nothing. No regret, no hesitation, no human second thoughts about the irreversibility of murder. "He was poisoned," I said, pulling my hand back. My fingers tingled with the residue of that reading, the way strong psychometric impressions sometimes lingered in my skin. Herbal, something in the thermos. It was meant to be slow, methodical. Restrepo nodded once, already on her radio, already moving into the particular purposefulness of a lawful death. The kind of official machinery that takes over when someone has crossed from living to murdered. But Desmond stared at the empty clearing, at the trees that had rearranged themselves into this protective barrier, and his weathered face suggested he understood something I didn't yet. The brackenwood wasn't keeping something in. It was keeping something out. It had recognized that the binding, the great magical architecture that held this town together, had been wounded. Someone had poisoned more than just Aldous Fenn. They'd poisoned the town's magical foundation. And the forest had responded the only way a forest knew how. It had enclosed the body, protected the scene, created a boundary between the murder and the binding itself. The town's magic was trying to tell us something. We just had to learn how to listen, and quickly, before whoever had poisoned Fenn decided to poison something else. Outside the clearing, the brackenwood pressed close. The forest had spoken. It had protected the body, enclosed the murder scene, created a boundary between the violation and the town's magical architecture. Now it waited for us to take the next step. Restrepo stood with her hands on her hips, looking at Aldous Fenn's peaceful expression one more time. There was respect in that look. Respect for someone who'd spent his life protecting systems most people never understood, who'd made the decision to stand against something that seemed philosophical, but was actually deadly. "He knew," I said suddenly. "Knew what?" Restrepo asked. "Knew that someone was coming for the ward stones. Knew that the binding was in danger. That's why he was so adamant about blocking those property acquisitions. That's why he'd become more strict, more protective. He felt it. Somehow, he understood the threat was real." Restrepo nodded slowly, understanding the implication. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was a planned elimination of someone who was actively protecting something valuable. This was targeted murder, based on ideological opposition. And we had to stop whoever had committed it before they struck again. Chapter 3. The Committee. The festival committee had met the evening before, in the Grange Hall's smaller room, the one with the windows overlooking the harbor. I attended when I could, mostly to handle logistics. The shop had festival inventory needs, supplies to coordinate, the kind of work that barely felt like work when Bea was there, making notes about coffee supplies and laughing at the absurdity of local politics. But Bea hadn't been there for the last meeting. She'd been closing Petrichor Coffee, dealing with an unexpected supply issue that had come up during afternoon rush. I'd attended alone, and Nolan had attended, and several others, including Tamsin Odell, who assisted Fenn with committee work and always looked slightly terrified of doing something wrong. Floyd Harrow, a long-standing committee member who'd argued with Fenn about nearly everything for decades and treated conflict like a form of entertainment, and Corinne Vidal, who'd become a generous sponsor of festival events over the past 2 years and had recently purchased several of the town's older properties. Restrepo wanted interviews. It was standard procedure. Last people to see the victim alive, the kind of detail that mattered in investigations both obvious and obscure. She set up in the sheriff's station, professional and methodical, and I watched from the periphery while pretending to organize herb inventory. In reality, I was studying everyone, letting my psychometric sense pick up impressions from the room itself. Floyd came in first, defensive before Restrepo had asked a single question, his hands clenched on the edge of the chair, knuckles white. Restrepo asked about the meeting with her particular brand of patient competence. Floyd's shoulders stiffened. "We disagreed," Floyd said, too loud. "About festival traditions, about who gets to decide what the committee does." Aldous was stuck in his ways. I wanted to try something new. We argued. That's what we did. We argued for 20 years. It was normal. Nothing different about it. "Did the argument escalate last night?" Restrepo asked quietly. "It was a normal argument," Floyd said, which sounded like a lie. "He was stubborn. I was frustrated. We both left the meeting and went our separate ways. I haven't seen him since." Tamsin came next, her grief genuine and visible. She cried while recounting the meeting, barely able to speak. Restrepo was gentle with her, offering tissues, giving her time. Tamsin explained that Fenn had been planning changes to the committee structure, significant changes that would remove her from her position as his assistant. "He said I'd been making unauthorized modifications to the historical records," Tamsin said between sobs. "But I was just trying to help. I was trying to make things more accurate. He didn't understand how much work I'd done, how much I cared about the project." "Had you two argued about this before?" Restrepo asked. "Not argued. He'd mentioned it, several times. But last night he said it was decided. He was removing me at the next official meeting." Corinne Vidal arrived composed and professional. She wore a dark blazer and her expression was precisely calibrated for sympathetic concern. When Restrepo asked about the meeting, Corinne answered smoothly, her voice modulated and controlled. "Aldous was passionate about historical preservation," Corinne said. "Sometimes that made him difficult to work with. He had strong opinions about development in town. We disagreed on some property matters, but it was never personal. I respected his dedication to the town's heritage." "You were at the meeting. How did it end?" Restrepo asked. "Around 8 o'clock, I think. Aldous mentioned going for a walk before heading home. Said the spring evening was too nice to waste indoors. I offered him coffee from the thermos I'd brought, but he declined. He said he wanted to clear his head." That was when I stepped forward. "You brought refreshments?" I asked. Corinne turned to me with a polite smile. "Coffee and some pastries from the bakery. Standard committee meeting fare. Why do you ask?" "Just cataloging details," I said, which was technically not a lie. After Corinne left, I pulled Restrepo aside. "She brought the thermos, the one Fenn was found with." Restrepo's eyes sharpened. "You're certain?" "I saw her set it on the table. I remember thinking it was nice, actually. Personal touch. She offered him coffee and he accepted. At least, I remember him taking it." That evening, I met Bea at Petra Coffee after we'd both closed our shops. The cafe smelled like the end of a busy day. Espresso dregs, the faint sweetness of cinnamon, the particular staleness of pastry crumbs left in the display case. Confetti, her sugar glider, was doing laps around the sugar containers with unusual intensity, a tiny, furry cyclone of concern. "She's been weird since this morning," Bee said, settling onto a stool and watching her familiar. "The forest thing spooked her. Familiars feel it before we do sometimes. They sense when the magical baseline shifts." "Quill's been weird too," I admitted. "Since last night. He said the tree line had shifted. I thought he was being dramatic, but looking back at things, he was right." Bee's sharp eyes focused. "The brackenwood doesn't move for no reason," she said. "Or it moves constantly, but not in patterns. Not like this. Not in response to something external. It doesn't have that kind of reaction." We sat with that for a moment. The comfortable silence of people who didn't need to fill every gap. My best friend since arriving in autumn, Bee had become essential in a way I hadn't expected. She understood the town, understood magic, understood me without requiring explanation. "You're thinking about the committee meeting," Bee said finally. "I'm thinking about everything. Floyd was arguing with Fenn about permit blockages and festival traditions. Tamsin looked terrified the entire time, like she was balancing on a knife edge. Corinne asked detailed questions about building foundations." "About Fenn's building specifically, or in general?" Bee leaned forward. "That's the thing. I don't remember. It felt general at the time, but now I'm wondering if it was more pointed than I realized. I was distracted." Bee smiled slightly. "By Nolan?" I didn't answer, which was answer enough. The preliminary toxicology report came back 2 days later. Cardiac arrest. No visible injuries, no trauma. The official cause of death would wait for more detailed analysis, but Restrepo called it suspicious, which was her way of saying she knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it yet. In the meantime, the festival continued, because Crabapple Bend understood that magic didn't pause for death. The lantern procession happened without the Brackenwood Trail. The town gathered, the tide turned, and magic rose higher than usual, drawn by concentration and ritual. But underneath the celebration, something had shifted. The Brackenwood had spoken, and Crabapple Bend was listening. 3 suspects, 3 motives, and somewhere in between them, a poison so precise that it seemed personal. I spent the evening reorganizing inventory at the Fossick, my hands moving through familiar tasks while my mind worked at the problem. Bee stopped by around closing time with coffee from Petra, her way of checking on me without making a big deal of it. We sat in the back room of my shop, surrounded by apothecary supplies and curiosities, and she let me talk through what I was thinking. "Floyd has the garden knowledge," I said, turning over the facts. "But his anger feels old, lived in, not fresh enough for murder." "What about Tamsin?" Bee asked, settling onto the stool across from my counter. "Afraid, anxious. But I didn't sense the kind of cold calculation you'd need to poison someone. Her emotion was fear-based, not plan-based." "And Corinne?" "That's where I keep getting stuck," I said. "The thermos came from her. She brought it to the meeting. She offered it to Fenn. But psychometry works on emotional charge, and I can't get a clear reading on her yet. She's too controlled, too composed." Bee sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Maybe that's your answer. Maybe the person you're looking for is someone who's so composed they barely register as human. Someone who can poison another person and feel nothing but the satisfaction of a job well done." The thought settled uncomfortably in my mind, because Bee was right. The person I was looking for wasn't someone driven by passion or rage. They were someone who'd made a decision and executed it with absolute professionalism. That was the scariest kind of killer. The one who was actually certain they were right. Chapter 4. 3 motives. The thermos sat in an evidence bag on Restrepo's desk, looking innocuous. Blue ceramic, the harbor seal faded from years of washing. The kind of thing that belonged to someone deliberate. Someone who would use the same container year after year, rather than discarding paper cups. Aldous Fenn had been that kind of person. "Touch it again," Restrepo said, "but gently. Tell me what you get." I'd become what passed for official psychometric help in Crabapple Bend. Not because I was particularly skilled, but because I was the only person openly practicing the ability. The gift was inconsistent, arriving sometimes as sharp images and sometimes as something more like emotional impressions. Never quite reliable, but better than guessing when the alternative was doing nothing. I peeled back the evidence bag and pressed my fingers to the ceramic. The reading clarified. Herbs, yes, but specific ones. My apothecary training helped parse the signature. Digitalis, foxglove, something with a heart component that I recognized because I'd specifically chosen not to stock it. Too dangerous without rigorous oversight. Mixed with what felt like bloodroot, maybe skullcap. The combination made my stomach tighten. These weren't garden herbs. These were plants chosen for their potency. And underneath the botanical signature was precision, measurement, testing. Someone had made this blend deliberately, methodically, with knowledge of exactly what they were doing and exactly what the result would be. Could someone have done this casually? Restrepo asked. No, I said. This took apothecary knowledge, understanding of herb interactions, access to specific plants. This wasn't someone grabbing something from a kitchen cabinet. This was planned. I spent the afternoon in the restricted section of the Fossick, pulling my Aunt Gretchen's old apothecary journals. She'd been the town's herbalist before me, before I'd even known magic was real. Her journals were meticulous. Detailed recipes, notes on magical amplification, thoughtful warnings about combinations that killed rather than healed. They sat on their shelf like dangerous history, knowledge locked in ink. There, a notation from 1987. A blend designed to mimic natural cardiac arrest. Technically not a poison because the effect was legitimate, stop the heart, but impossible to distinguish from natural failure if you didn't know to look for it. Gretchen had noted the formula with careful precision, and then noted underneath, her handwriting sharp with judgment. Never made, never will make, serves no purpose but harm. The blend in Fenn's thermos matched almost exactly. Nolan found me on the floor of the Fossick's back room, surrounded by journals and notes. Quill asleep on my lap in that particular boneless way he collapsed when emotionally exhausted. The Hedgehog had given up complaining around hour 3 of my research, his little body trusting mine to support him while he retreated into sleep. Restrepo said you might be here, he said, settling onto the floor beside me with the ease of someone comfortable with physical practicality. You look terrible. Someone poisoned him deliberately, I said. Methodically, with knowledge, with intent. I felt the Brackenwood shift, Nolan said. Last night, around the time it happened probably. It felt like the forest was responding to something, trying to protect something. I thought maybe there'd been an accident or a magical surge. I didn't expect this. Nobody did, I said. He reached over and touched one of the journals. Your aunt wrote these? She was the herbalist before me, before I knew this place existed. She left everything here when she went to her sister's place in Seattle. She didn't want the position anymore. Did she ever mention who'd tried to acquire binding information? Or who'd asked about vulnerabilities in the town's magical architecture? I looked at him, trying to parse what he was asking. The specificity felt important. No. Why? Because whoever did this knew enough about Fenn to know he'd be at the committee meeting. They knew he'd have his thermos. They understood his patterns. That's not random, that's targeted. And the precision of the blend you're describing, that's not casual experimentation. That's someone with specific goals. Someone who was willing to kill to achieve them. The late afternoon light slanted through the shop's back windows, catching dust motes and turning them to gold. Quill shifted in my lap, his tiny nose twitching in sleep. Outside, the town was preparing for the second night of festival. Music and lights and celebration. Inside the Fossick, Nolan and I sat on the floor, surrounded by dangerous knowledge. "Let's think about motive," I said slowly. Floyd hated Fenn. They'd been feuding for decades. But the poison itself suggests someone with herbalist knowledge, someone with training. "Floyd has a garden," Nolan said thoughtfully. "I've seen it. It's extensive. He keeps rare plants there." "Does that mean he has the knowledge to create this specific blend? Does having access to plants equal knowing how to combine them into something this lethal?" "I don't know," Nolan admitted. "But it means he has access to the materials, at least." We worked through the other suspects methodically. Tamsin Odell was being removed from the committee. Restrepo had confirmed that Fenn was planning to publicly announce her removal at the festival's closing ceremony. That was motive. Embarrassment, loss of position, anger at betrayal. But Tamsin was a scheduling assistant, not an herbalist. Where would she get the knowledge to create a poison this precise? "Corinne," I said, and the name felt wrong coming out of my mouth. "She brought the thermos. She's made inquiries about old herbal remedies. She's been buying buildings in town, historic buildings specifically." "What would that have to do with poisoning someone?" Nolan asked, but thoughtfully, like he already suspected the answer. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." Over the next 2 days, I researched Corinne Vidal's property acquisitions. I pulled tax records, talking to Patrice Huang at the town clerk's office, cross-referencing dates and building addresses. A pattern emerged, slowly at first, then undeniably. Corinne had purchased the Harborview Inn. She'd made an offer on the old bank building. She'd attempted to acquire the Grange Hall itself, but Fenn had blocked that purchase through his position on the committee. She'd looked at the original library building, another historic property with protection designations. And when I mentioned this to Nolan, his face went pale. "What?" I asked. "Those buildings," he said. "I think Fenn was protecting them specifically, and I think I know why. But I need to talk to Desmond first." The festival continued around us. 3 days of tide magic and celebration, and tourists enjoying the town's peculiar charm. But underneath the lights and music, something darker was moving. Someone in Crabapple Bend had decided that Aldous Fenn was expendable. And they'd done it with the kind of precision that suggested this was just the beginning. Quill and I walked home through the decorated streets late that evening, after the shop had closed. The Hedgehog was unusually quiet, his typical sharp commentary replaced with a steady presence. He understood, in the way animals understood, that something fundamental had shifted. The town's magic felt different, wounded in a way that couldn't be seen but could definitely be sensed. At the Fossick, I made tea and sat in the quiet of my living space above the shop. The place had become home over the past 6 months. The worn furniture that had come with the lease, the books I'd added, the particular arrangements that reflected how I liked to live. It felt safe. But safety was an illusion if Crabapple Bend's binding was genuinely at risk. I thought about Aldous Fenn, about the 14 years he'd spent protecting buildings and systems that most people didn't even know existed. I thought about what kind of conviction it took to dedicate that much of your life to something most people would consider unnecessary preservation. And I thought about someone deciding that conviction was worth murdering. Chapter 5. Wardstones. Desmond Crisp's house was exactly what you'd expect from a historian who'd lived in the same place for 40 years. Books everywhere, newspapers stacked in orderly piles, oracles enclosure taking up a corner of the front room with the reverence of a shrine. The tortoise had been living there longer than most people in town had been alive. Nolan and I sat on a couch that predated 1995, while Desmond made tea in his kitchen. I heard the kettle whistle, heard him moving about with the deliberate grace of someone following a familiar ritual. Oracle watched us with an intensity that suggested she already knew why we were there. Ancient eyes, ancient knowing. Wardstones, Desmond said, settling into his reading chair with the kind of deliberation that meant this story was important. Tea steamed in his hands. The Historical Preservation Committee was never really about preserving buildings. That was the cover story, the official narrative. The real purpose was protecting the buildings that housed wardstones. He gestured to Oracle, who pulled her ancient head back into her shell. The binding, I said slowly. The magical architecture that holds the town together. It needs anchor points. Exactly, Desmond said. Wardstones are physical manifestations of the binding itself. They anchor the magic to specific locations, buildings mostly because buildings are permanent structures. The town's protection depends on those wardstones remaining intact and aligned. If they're removed or damaged, the binding weakens. And Fenn was blocking Corinne's property acquisitions because, Nolan started. Because those buildings contained wardstones, I finished. She was trying to buy them. To remove them, maybe. To damage them. Not maybe, Desmond said. Deliberately. Systematically. And I've been researching Corinne Vidal. There isn't much to research, which is itself suspicious. She appears in public records about 2 years ago. No history before that. No family connections I can trace. No documented education. No prior employment. But I did find something interesting. He pulled out a folder thick with papers. Financial records, property registrations, incorporation documents. Nolan scanned through them while I sat frozen, understanding what I was seeing without fully processing it yet. The papers told a story in numbers and legal language. She's a shell, Nolan said quietly. All these properties are purchased through different companies. Different financing, different paper trails. But the common denominator is her. And the money trail, Desmond said, leads to Miriam Goss. My stomach dropped. Miriam Goss. The woman who'd tried to murder half the town last autumn. The woman currently serving time in a maximum security magical facility. The woman I'd trapped psychometrically so she couldn't use magic anymore. The anti-binding network, I said. You're saying Corinne is part of it. I'm saying she's working for them, Desmond corrected. Or with them. Miriam Goss had connections before she was arrested. Financial backing, infrastructure, people. Those connections didn't vanish when she went to prison. If anything, they reorganized. They adapted. I left Desmond's house feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me. What had seemed like a murder in response to personal grievance had transformed into something larger, something coordinated, something that had nothing to do with Fenn's personal relationships and everything to do with the town's magical foundations. Someone had decided to dismantle Crabapple Bend's protections systematically. We need to verify, Nolan said as we walked back toward the harbor. If Corinne is targeting wardstones, then the properties she's acquired have to have them. We need to confirm that connection. How do we do that? I asked. Desmond seems to know, but I don't understand how to identify them. I might be able to feel them, Nolan said. Water magic is connected to the binding in ways I don't fully understand, but I've always sensed the wards. They have a resonance. When they're intact, it feels steady. When they're compromised, it feels disrupted. We visited Corinne's properties that afternoon. The Harborview Inn first. It was gorgeous, the kind of restoration that showed genuine respect for historical architecture. The lobby had been refreshed with care, period details respected, modern conveniences added subtly. But when Nolan stood in the center of the space, his hands clenched. I felt him gathering his magic, extending his senses. "There," he said finally, pointing to a specific spot. "Under the floorboards in the east wing. There's a wardstone there. Or there was." I knelt and pressed my hands to the floor, feeling beyond the physical. Nolan was right. I could sense it. The ghost of something. A hollow space where something important had been. But underneath that absence was something else. Intentional removal. Methodical excavation. Not damage, but deliberate extraction. "She's taken it," I whispered. "She removed it." The bank building was worse. We found the location of another wardstone in the original vault. Nolan sensed it. I confirmed it through touch. But this one was still partially in place. Barely. Someone had started the extraction process but hadn't finished. The stone was cracked, weakened, bleeding its magical potential into the air. "Why stop?" I asked Nolan as we stood in the empty vault, the air feeling thin and wrong. "Because Fenn died," Nolan said. "She didn't need to continue the cover-up if Fenn was gone. She thought she'd eliminated the only obstacle to her property acquisitions. She didn't know we'd figure out what she was doing." We walked back through the town in the golden afternoon light. The Tide Pool Festival was ending, the tide returning to normal, the magic settling back to baseline. But underneath the surface, something had cracked. The binding was being systematically attacked, and if the wardstones were compromised, then the town's protection was deteriorating, whether we could see it or not. "We have to tell Restrepo," I said. "We have to prove it first," Nolan countered. "If we go to her with this theory about anti-binding networks and systematic magical sabotage, she'll want evidence. Physical evidence. Right now we have suspicions and psychometric readings." "Then we get evidence," I said. "We find the poison garden. We connect the herbal blend to Corinne specifically. We prove she had the knowledge and the motive and the means." Nolan reached over and took my hand. It was deliberate and intentional. The kind of gesture that acknowledged something we'd both been avoiding for months. His palm was warm, his grip steady, his presence steady beside me. "Together," he said. "We do this together." I didn't pull away. I held on. Later that evening, after Nolan left and the shop was closed, I sat with Quill in the back room of the Fossick, surrounded by my aunt's journals and the maps and evidence spread across the table. Bea appeared with a thermos of coffee from Petra, her evening ritual when she knew I'd be working late. She didn't ask questions, just set the thermos down and sat with me in comfortable silence for a while. "You're close," Bea said finally. "We're close," I agreed. "But close isn't the same as certain. I can feel something connecting the pieces, but I can't see the entire picture yet." "Trust the process," Bea said. "Trust that you're smart enough and perceptive enough to find it. And trust that the town, all of us, will help you figure this out." She left after that, leaving me with the coffee and Quill's quiet presence, and the sense that maybe, in a place like Crabapple Bend, trust was something you could actually depend on. Chapter 6. The Poison Garden. The ley line that connected to the tide pool stairs was visible only to people who knew where to look. Desmond had pointed it out to me months ago, a shimmer in the air, a place where the town's magical architecture burned brighter. The binding was stronger near ley lines, and therefore more vulnerable to tampering. Near the tide pool stairs, in a sheltered hollow between two rocky outcroppings, someone had cultivated a garden. I found it while looking for exactly that. a place where someone with detailed apothecary knowledge would grow plants specifically chosen for their dangerous properties. The garden wasn't visible from the main path. You had to know it was there to find it. You had to be searching for it. The plants were arranged with deliberate precision. Hemlock stood in the back row, tall and feathery. Digitalis occupied a carefully measured section, its purple flowers beautiful and absolutely lethal. Aconite sprawled in another corner, its delicate blooms hiding their toxicity. Bloodroot, skullcap, and plants I didn't recognize but suspected were equally dangerous. This wasn't a wildflower garden. This was cultivation, research, deliberate design. Quill sent me a burst of pure warning, and I understood. This was where Fenn's poison had been created. But I needed proof, not just suspicion, but understanding. I reached for one of the digitalis plants, my fingers hovering above the stem. When I touched it, the vision came through sharp and present. Corinne was in this garden at sunset, her hands moving with practiced precision as she measured plants. She had a scale with her, brass weights, a leather journal filled with notations. Her focus was absolute. This wasn't casual gardening. This was someone following a recipe, someone who'd studied apothecary work with dedication. I pulled back, breathing through the residue of the vision. Psychometry usually gave me impressions, but sometimes, when the emotional charge was strong enough, it gave me scenes. This had been a scene. I took photographs with my phone before collecting samples, my hands shaking slightly. Quill helped by keeping watch, his small form elevated on a nearby rock, his senses extended toward the path. If anyone came, he'd know first. But I wanted more than samples. I wanted evidence of her knowledge. I reached for another plant, let the vision come. This time I saw Corinne with my Aunt Gretchen's journals, the restricted apothecary texts that should have been secure in the Fossick. But there she was, 3 months ago, leafing through pages in what looked like a hotel room, studying the notation about cardiac arrest, studying the precise warnings Gretchen had written about which plants could kill. I gasped and pulled back. My aunt had locked those journals. How had Corinne accessed them? Another plant, another vision. Corinne in my shop at night. I recognized the moment, 2 months ago when I'd thought the door was secure, but clearly someone had found a way in. She was photographing pages, recording formulas. Her hands were steady, her expression focused. This was someone on a mission. And then, the bloodroot plant. When my fingers touched it, the vision came through so strong I had to kneel. Corinne at the Grange Hall during the committee meeting. She was methodically pouring liquid from a small vial into the thermos. Her movements were confident, practiced. She knew exactly how much, knew exactly what she was doing. The poison wasn't improvisation. It was execution of a plan methodically laid over months. I pulled back, gasping. Quill was beside me, his tiny body pressed against my leg, his concern a solid weight. The samples went into the Fossick's secure storage while I waited for Restrepo's forensic testing on the thermos contents. But I already knew what those results would show. The plants in this garden matched the herbal signature I'd read from the poison. The precision of the composition, the precise measurements, all of it pointed towards someone with serious apothecary training. Someone like Corinne Vidal. The results came back on the 4th day of the festival. The thermos contained a brew made from digitalis, bloodroot, and several other plants in precise proportions. The dose was precise, enough to cause cardiac failure in someone with an already vulnerable heart, something Restrepo discovered by looking into Fenn's medical history. Fenn had a history of arrhythmia. Minor, manageable, never life-threatening. But someone who knew his medical status and understood pharmacology could exploit that, could target him specifically with a poison that looked like a natural death. Meanwhile, Floyd was being questioned. Restrepo had found his fingerprints on the thermos. He'd handed it back to Fenn during the committee meeting when Fenn had briefly set it down. It was the kind of detail that looked damning in initial investigation. Floyd's defensiveness made it worse. I attended one of his interviews, hanging in the back of the sheriff's station while Restrepo worked through her questions. Floyd was sweating. His hands shook. He kept insisting he hadn't poisoned anyone, that he'd argued with Fenn but never wished him actual harm. "Your fingerprints are on the thermos," Restrepo said calmly. "You admitted to a heated argument the evening of his death. You have a documented history of conflict with the victim. You have a garden where you grow various plants." "That doesn't make me a murderer," Floyd said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I garden. I argue. That's not the same as poisoning someone." But he looked guilty, and looking guilty was enough for Restrepo to hold him pending additional investigation. I pulled Restrepo aside later. "It's not him," I said quietly. "You have proof of that?" Restrepo asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer was no. "I have visions," I said. "Psychometric readings. When I touched the plants in that poison garden, I saw Corinne preparing the poison. I saw her studying the apothecary formulas. I saw her putting the poison in the thermos. It was her, not Floyd." Restrepo stared at me for a long moment. "Visions aren't admissible in court." "But they're accurate," I said. "And if you look at the evidence I'm giving you, you'll find that the psychometry aligns with the physical facts." "I need something I can actually prosecute with," Restrepo said. "Can you give me that?" "I'm working on it," I said. That evening, Nolan came to the Fossick after closing. We worked at the back counter, surrounded by my aunt's journals and my own notes, trying to piece together a complete picture. The poison garden, the ward stones, the property acquisitions, Corinne's background, or lack thereof. "We need to find where she's keeping the extracted ward stones," Nolan said. "If we can find physical evidence that she removed them, it proves premeditation. It proves she had a reason to want Fenn dead." "The building she owns," I said, thinking through it. "The Harborview Inn is finished, but the bank building is still under renovation. That's where the second wardstone is partially extracted. Maybe she's storing them somewhere obvious because nobody would think to look?" "We can't search her property without a warrant," Nolan said. "And we don't have enough evidence for a warrant." "Then we get evidence," I said. The plan took shape over the next hour, fueled by Bee's coffee and the particular determination that comes from knowing someone has committed murder and believing you can prove it. We couldn't search her property legally, but we could observe. We could gather information. We could push on her psychological pressure points until she either confessed or made a mistake. In the meantime, Quill hopped onto the counter with a feeling burst of something complicated. Concern and determination, and something almost like approval. My familiar understood what I was planning, and he stood with me in it. The town continued celebrating its festival, unaware that the binding, the magical architecture that held everything together, was being systematically dismantled. Unaware that the woman sponsoring festival events had murdered the man protecting them from that very threat. We had work to do before she struck again. Bee appeared at the Fossick around sunset with confetti circling her shoulders and a bag of fresh baked goods from her cafe. She didn't ask questions, just set everything down and started making tea in my kitchen like she'd done it 100 times. "You look like you're carrying something heavy," she said finally, settling onto the counter next to where I was organizing evidence. "The poison garden," I said. "It's real. It's documented, and it proves someone in this town had the knowledge and intent to create something lethal. Someone we all know. someone we probably liked. That's the hardest part, B said. Learning that people who seem normal on the outside can be planning terrible things underneath. That charm and competence aren't the same as decency. We sat with that weight for a while. It was the reason B's presence mattered. She understood that sometimes investigation wasn't about being cheerful or optimistic. It was about sitting with the hard truths and not letting them consume you completely. Chapter 7. The Network. The financial records took time to untangle. Desmond had given me access to his research, and I spent the better part of a day cross-referencing property purchases, shell company registrations, and bank transfers. The coffee at Petra Coffee went cold in my hands while I worked through the numbers. What emerged was a picture of coordination that reached far beyond Crabapple Bend. Corinne Vidal's 5 property acquisitions in town weren't random. They formed a pattern, a geometric arrangement that Desmond recognized immediately when I sketched it out for him. He stared at the map for a long moment before speaking. "Wardstone coordinates," Desmond said, studying the map. "The binding's anchor points form a specific grid. If you remove enough of them, the whole thing becomes unstable. The town loses protection gradually until, eventually, there's nothing left." "How long?" I asked. "How long would it take before the binding collapsed completely?" "Months, maybe a year. But once it starts failing, magical instability increases exponentially. Crabapple Bend would become uninhabitable for anyone sensitive to magic, which, coincidentally, is a lot of people." I pushed back from the table and walked to the Fossick's front window, looking out at the town. The festival was winding down. Tomorrow would be the closing ceremony. The streets were still decorated, still holding the magic of celebration. But underneath it, something was dying. The money trail was what broke the whole thing open. Desmond and I traced it methodically, following the path of funds through shell companies and offshore accounts. Corinne's operations received funding from entities I didn't recognize at first, but Desmond did. He'd seen these names before in his research into anti-binding networks. "It's a campaign," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "Not just here. Multiple towns, multiple bindings. They're systematically attacking magical communities." "To what end?" Desmond asked, though I thought he already knew. "Power," I said. "Control. If they can eliminate the bindings, they can control the magic. Or sell it. Or weaponize it. Any of the above." And the connections led back, always back, to Miriam Goss. The woman I'd psychometrically trapped. The one currently imprisoned in a maximum security magical facility. She still had reach. She still had resources. She still had people committed to her cause. Nolan came to the Fossick that evening, and I showed him everything. The financial records, the property map, the documented connections to Miriam Goss. His face darkened as he read through the details. "She played me," he said finally. "She came to town. She was generous. She asked the right questions. She made me feel like she understood the town's character. And all the while, she was planning to dismantle the binding that protects it." "She played all of us," I said. "That's the whole point. She gained trust while systematically removing the magical infrastructure of the town." We called Restrepo. She came to the Fossick with her notebook and her particular expression of competent concern, and we laid out everything. The financial connections, the property acquisitions targeting Wardstone locations, the herbal poison matching my aunt's dangerous formula, the poison garden we'd discovered. "This is circumstantial," Restrepo said when we finished. "Good circumstantial, but still circumstantial. I need direct evidence connecting Corinne to the poison. I need proof she cultivated that garden. I need something that will hold up in court." "She has to have made notes," I said. "Records of her experiments. If she learned apothecary from my aunt's journals, she would have documented what she was doing, written down her attempts. Then we find those documents, Restrepo said. Legally, which means we need probable cause. We need a warrant. Can you get one? Nolan asked. Not yet. Not without evidence admissible in court. But I can request a wellness check at her rental property. Make sure she's not in distress. Officers are allowed to look around if they're concerned about someone's safety. The wellness check happened the next morning. I wasn't present, but Restrepo reported back that Corinne's rental house appeared empty. Corinne herself was gone. No note, no indication of when she'd left. Just an empty property and a lingering sense that we'd been working with incomplete information. She ran, I said, understanding it immediately. She knows we're investigating. She knows we found the connection to Miriam Goss. She's gone before we can arrest her. Maybe, Restrepo said. Or maybe she's handling business elsewhere. We're not going to panic. We issue a statement that we want to talk to her as a person of interest. We put her information on the wire. We wait. But I couldn't wait. I spent the festival's closing ceremony standing in the crowd, watching people celebrate while knowing that the town's protective magic was actively being dismantled. Nolan stood beside me, and our hands touched in the darkness, deliberate, a grounding point, an acknowledgement that neither of us was alone in this. Corinne Vidal had murdered Aldous Fenn because he stood in her way. She'd systematized the removal of the ward stones that held the binding intact. She'd coordinated with an organized network dedicated to destroying magical infrastructure across multiple states. And she'd done all of it while gaining everyone's trust. The closing ceremony ended. The festival was over. And tomorrow, Restrepo said, she would issue a warrant for Corinne's arrest. With or without full evidence, the connections were clear enough. The network was real enough. Justice would come. But I spent that night at the Fossick, unable to sleep, knowing that justice always came too late for someone. It came too late for Aldous Fenn, who'd spent 14 years protecting buildings and ward stones and the town's magical infrastructure. It came too late for Tamsin, who'd lost her position. It came too late for Floyd, who sat in custody for a crime he didn't commit. I made tea with meticulous precision, brewing a blend of chamomile and lavender that my Aunt Gretchen had favored when she needed to settle her mind. The ritual of heating water, measuring leaves, waiting for the steep. It was grounding. It reminded me that some things moved at their own pace, couldn't be rushed, required patience and attention. I reorganized the apothecary section by candlelight, moving bottles from one shelf to another, creating new arrangements that made sense to my tired mind. The motion was meditative. Each bottle had a purpose, each herb a known effect. In a world of uncertainty and moral complexity, the apothecary section felt like truth, tangible, functional, honest. Quill settled on my shoulder as I worked, occasionally sending small bursts of companionship. I talked to him about the nature of responsibility, about what it meant to know something was true but not be able to prove it yet, about the particular weight of pursuing someone who decided they were justified in their actions. By dawn, the shop was reorganized and my mind was slightly clearer. Not resolved, not peaceful, but steadier. Ready to keep pushing, keep investigating, keep pursuing the truth, even when it felt like the guilty had already escaped. Chapter 8. Misdirection. Restrepo issued the warrant for Corinne Vidal's arrest on the morning after the festival's closing ceremony. By then, Corinne had already been gone for 2 days, and the various agencies tasked with finding her were developing a picture of someone who'd planned her exit methodically. Bank accounts emptied, rental property abandoned, forwarding address pointing to a P.O. box in Portland that would take weeks to trace. But that wasn't what slowed the investigation. What slowed the investigation was the bureaucratic retaliation that started the next day. A health inspector showed up at the Fossick without warning, clipboard in hand and a list of supposed violations. Improper storage of herbal compounds, inadequate labeling on my apothecary section, an unlicensed animal in the workplace, referring to Quill with a tone that suggested hedgehogs were somehow dangerous to public safety. "We'll need to issue a citation," the inspector said, his expression professionally bland. "You'll have time to remediate, but until you do, you can't sell anything from the apothecary section." "On what grounds?" I asked, keeping my voice level though my hands had clenched into fists. "State regulations regarding herbal sales require specific licensing and specific conditions. You don't meet them currently." It was technically defensible. The regulations existed. I hadn't been particularly concerned about them because I'd been focused on building the shop and understanding my new life in Crabapple Bend. But they were real enough for an inspector to cite me. Then came the zoning complaint. The Fossick was in a zone that technically required special permits for mixed-use retail. Someone had filed a complaint about the combination of curio shop and apothecary. The town had been grandfathering the space under the previous owner's usage, but now that I was operating it, technically it needed reclassification. And then there was the property tax reassessment that arrived 3 days later. The values suddenly increased by 20% based on enhanced usage and increased business value. I understood what was happening. Corinne Vidal had friends, or connections, or had simply pre-positioned these complaints in case her operation was threatened. The bureaucracy was being weaponized against me. "This is harassment," Nolan said, looking at the stack of citations and complaints we'd accumulated. We were sitting in the Fossick's back room at midnight, surrounded by my aunt's journals and the evidence of a campaign designed to squeeze me out of business. Bea had left a thermos of coffee and some pastries before closing Petra Coffee, her way of supporting us without adding pressure. "Technically, it's all legitimate," I said bitterly. "Everything they're citing me on is real. It just never mattered before because nobody looked." "Restrepo should be able to help," Nolan offered. "She knows the town. She could pull strings." "And then it becomes political," I said. "I don't want to owe favors. I don't want this place to depend on the sheriff's goodwill. The point of the Fossick is that it's independent. It exists because people choose to come here, not because I'm connected to the right people." But the pressure kept coming. The building inspector showed up the next week, finding issues with the electrical wiring and the water pressure. Nothing immediately dangerous, but enough to shut down the apothecary section completely while I remediated. The health department issued a follow-up violation, more detailed, more damaging. It was strategic, thorough, the kind of bureaucratic assault that doesn't require visible corruption, just systematic application of regulations that technically applied but were usually overlooked. Floyd Harrow was arrested formally on the 5th day after the festival ended. The evidence against him, his fingerprints on the thermos, his documented conflict with Fenn, his garden full of herbs, was circumstantial, but it was enough for Restrepo to hold him pending trial. I knew he was innocent. I could read it in the psychometric impressions of the thermos, feel it in the signature of the poison itself. The precision of the blend didn't match Floyd's nature. The deliberation didn't fit his personality. But proving his innocence meant proving Corinne's guilt, and Corinne had vanished. "We're missing something," I said to Restrepo, sitting across from her in her office. The sheriff's station smelled like coffee and paper, and the particular staleness that came from buildings without enough sunlight. The poison garden, the financials, the wardstone extraction, all of it points to her. But without her testimony, without finding her somewhere, none of it is enough to convict. "We're working on it," Restrepo said. "I've got feelers out to neighboring counties. She'll surface eventually. People like that always do. But I wasn't certain of that. I wasn't certain of anything anymore except that Aldous Fenn was dead, Floyd Harrow was in jail for a murder he didn't commit, and Corinne Vidal had managed to disappear into whatever network had sent her to Crabapple Bend in the first place. The Fossick's business dried up under the weight of the violations. People stopped coming in, not because they didn't want to, but because the uncertainty of the situation made it complicated. Could they buy apothecary goods if I wasn't licensed? Was coming to the shop while it was under investigation bad business? The social currency of uncertainty worked against me as effectively as the official restrictions. Nolan came by late one evening after I'd closed the shop and was sitting alone with Quill, staring at nothing. He brought coffee from Petrichor and a grim expression. "I talked to Desmond," he said, settling onto the stool across from the counter. "He thinks Corinne's long gone. He thinks she completed enough of her objectives that the anti-binding network might move on to their next target. We might not catch her." "Then Floyd goes to jail for something he didn't do," I said flatly. "And the town loses faith in the justice system. And the faucet closes because the bureaucracy has beaten me into submission. And the magical infrastructure of this place remains compromised. Is that the outcome?" Nolan reached across the counter and took my hand. It was a deliberate gesture, not ambiguous, not deniable. He threaded his fingers through mine and held firm. "No," he said. "We figure it out. We find Corinne. We prove Floyd's innocence. We fix what she damaged." "How?" I asked. "She's gone. The evidence is circumstantial. The bureaucratic pressure is mounting." "We work the case," Nolan said, "and we don't give up." We sat like that for a long time, hands linked across the counter of my struggling shop. Quill hopped up beside our clasped hands, and I felt his emotion. Not his words, never his words, but his feeling burst of warmth and determination and something that almost felt like love. Outside, Crabapple Bend was settling into the transition between festival and ordinary time. The tourists were leaving. The town was returning to its baseline magic. And underneath it all, the binding was struggling, wounded, weakened by the systematic removal of its anchor points. Nolan and I couldn't fix all of that tonight. We couldn't bring Corinne back, or exonerate Floyd, or undo what had been done to my shop. But we could try. We could keep trying. And sometimes, in a town like Crabapple Bend where magic was real and the dead didn't always stay quiet, trying was enough. For now. I closed the shop around midnight and walked upstairs to my apartment. The space was quiet, warm, filled with the particular comfort of a place that had started to feel like home. Quill was already asleep in his enclosure, his tiny body curled into a satisfied ball. The hedgehog had earned rest. His instincts had been right about everything so far. I made tea and sat by the window, looking out at the dark street below. Tomorrow we'd have more answers. Tomorrow we might be closer to the truth. But tonight, I just wanted to sit with the knowledge that I'd tried, that I'd kept pushing even when everything seemed impossible, that I'd held Nolan's hand and believed, at least for a moment, that together we could fix what someone had broken. That was all any of us could do. Chapter 9. Deeper Roots. The thermos sat on my kitchen table, wrapped in cloth the same way Restrepo had handed it to me. I'd read it once already, a surface impression, useful but incomplete. Now I sat with my hands steady around it, letting my ability root deeper into its history. The sensation came in layers. First, glass, ceramic interior, the ghost of liquid that had tasted of bergamot and something chemical underneath. But not the hands that held it. not the intention behind the poison. I needed to go further back, to the moments of preparation. I closed my eyes and steadied my breathing, the way I'd learned to do over the past 6 months of living in Crabapple Bend. The technique was meditation and surrender in equal measure. I breathed. Let my psychometry sink through the object's memory like it was reading through pages of a book. The thermos held its history in layers. Aldous drinking from it that morning, confident and alive. Aldous carrying it to the brackenwood, unaware. Aldous slumping, his heart betraying him in a sealed clearing where help couldn't reach him. But before that, before the death, there, hands. Manicured nails, the kind that cost money and meticulous maintenance. Fingers that didn't hesitate, didn't shake, didn't betray even a moment of doubt. The poison being measured with precision, not anger or panic. Calculation. This was planned, intentional. Cold in a way that made my skin crawl, made my stomach tighten with the realization of what I was touching. The hands belonged to someone confident. Someone who'd done delicate work before, who understood the specific gravity of what she was doing. I felt the shape of her fingers, the specific way she held the brush she used to measure the poison into the liquid, the way she moved through space without doubt or hesitation. No fear, no regret. Just the steady competence of someone executing a plan she'd already accepted. Corinne Vidal. It was unmistakable once I had the context. Like being told a name and suddenly recognizing a face you'd seen 100 times without understanding. The confidence, the precision, the specific way her fingers curved as she worked. It was all her. I opened my eyes, quill pressed against my side, sending sharp-edged certainty that felt like affirmation. Yes, that one. The hedgehog's feeling bursts carried something almost satisfied, as though he'd known all along and was pleased I'd finally caught up. My next step was the committee meeting room at the Grange Hall. Restrepo gave me access after hours, and I spent 2 hours touching every chair, every table edge, every surface that held human contact during the committee meetings before Fenn died. The space still held the residue of their presence. Conversations, disagreements, the weight of decisions made and unmade. Each person's emotional residue painted itself across my senses in distinct colors. Floyd's chair held anger, certainly. But it was old anger, decades of professional friction with a man who disagreed with his every proposal. Underneath the anger, though, I found grief. Complicated, terrible grief that suggested Floyd had respected Aldous Fenn even as they fought. This wasn't the rage of someone who'd just murdered a colleague. This was the rage of someone who'd lost someone he'd hated and had to reckon with that contradiction. Tamsin's chair held anxiety, the particular flavor of someone worried about keeping her job. Anxiety about the Preservation Committee's direction, about Fenn's increasing strictness regarding what could and couldn't be changed in the Wardstone buildings. Her fear of making mistakes, of not being good enough, of failing at something she'd inherited reluctantly. But underneath the anxiety, regret, sadness, the complicated guilt of someone who'd wanted to do better by a mentor and hadn't had the chance. And Corinne's chair. I almost flinched away from it. The coldness was staggering, genuinely staggering in the way you flinch away from ice. Not anger, not fear, not the human emotions that create friction between people. What I found in that chair was clarity, absolute clarity, calculation. A mind that had decided something needed to happen and was proceeding methodically to make it happen. No doubt, no hesitation, no regret. No room for second thoughts or conscience. This was someone who'd already decided that Aldous Fenn was an obstacle to be removed. someone who'd made peace with that decision and moved forward with implementation. I gathered my findings and brought them to Restrepo's office the next morning. Floyd didn't kill him, I said without preamble. I'm certain. His emotional signature at the committee meeting was grief, not preparation. The anger is old, decades old, but there's nothing in him that suggests premeditation or intent. Restrepo leaned back in her chair, studying me. Tell me what you found instead. So I walked her through it methodically. The thermos reading, the hands, the manicured nails, the precision of measurement, the complete absence of hesitation. The cold calculation that meant someone had planned this with thoroughness and care. Then the committee chair analysis, the emotional residues, the clear distinction between Floyd's complicated grief and the coldness that radiated from Corinne's presence. Tamsin? Restrepo asked. Worried about her job, sad about Fenn, anxious about her future on the committee, but not guilty of his death. And Corinne? Cold, I said. Completely cold. Like sitting in a room where the temperature dropped 20 degrees and nobody else noticed. She decided something needed to happen and made it happen. That's all the emotion she had about it. Restrepo nodded slowly, and I could see her fitting my observations into the financial records she'd been examining. That matches what I'm finding in the financials. Corinne has been methodically acquiring property in Crabapple Bend for 3 years. 5 buildings total with documented wardstones. She's been blocked twice by the Historical Preservation Committee. Both times, Aldous Fenn voted directly against her. So he was in her way, I said. He was an obstacle, Restrepo agreed. He understood the binding architecture. He understood what those buildings meant, and he was willing to use his position to stop her acquisitions. Can you release Floyd? I asked. Based on my reading? Yes, Restrepo said. The evidence points clearly to Corinne now. I'll need more concrete evidence, fingerprints, forensic analysis, something that ties her directly to the poison itself. But your psychometric reading eliminates him as a suspect. That's enough for me to release him pending further investigation. By evening, Floyd had been released. I saw him at the Fossick as he passed by, carrying a small package that he set down on my counter with trembling hands. The relief on his face was visible even from across the street. The specific relief of someone who'd been falsely accused and suddenly vindicated. Whatever complications existed between him and Aldous Fenn, at least the accusation was removed. One person cleared. One guilty party identified with certainty. The distance between those two things, though, was still growing in front of us like an unmapped forest, and I had no guarantee I could navigate it successfully. That afternoon, I closed the Fossick and walked to Petra Coffee. B was in her element, steaming milk, pulling shots, creating the particular magic that came from caring about every detail of what you produced. She saw me and immediately started making my usual without asking. You figured something out, she said, handing me the perfect cup. How do you always know? I asked. Because you have a specific look when you've made a breakthrough, B said. You get this quiet certainty, like the puzzle pieces finally clicked into place. Floyd's innocent, I said. I'm absolutely certain now. He didn't poison Fenn. Someone else did. Someone colder, more methodical. Someone who planned this like a business strategy. B's expression grew serious. Then we need to find them before they realize you know. That's the thing, I said. I'm not sure they don't already know. Corinne was at the committee meeting. She saw me take the thermos. She knows I have psychometric abilities. If she's smart, and everything suggests she is, she's calculating her next move based on what I know and what I can prove. It was a race against time now. A race to gather evidence before the guilty party decided that removing me from the equation was more efficient than fighting through the investigation. Chapter 10. The Lowest Tide. The spring tide reached its lowest point on a Wednesday, and the Tide Pool Festival continued regardless of murder investigations and the complications they brought. Life in Crabapple Bend didn't pause for death. It simply worked around it, the way water flows around stone, the way a town continues breathing even as it mourns. I walked the exposed tide pools in the late afternoon, when the sun was still high enough to turn the water to liquid gold, when the shadows of the rocks created pockets of deeper color against the stone. The spring tide brought the tide pool stairs ley line down to accessible level, exposed in a way that only happened 3 times a year. The stairs themselves, physical stone, carved into the cliff face centuries ago by practitioners whose names had been forgotten, emerged from the water like something waking from hibernation, like a memory becoming solid again. Touching the rocks was overwhelming. My psychometric ability had grown stronger since I'd arrived in autumn. I learned to modulate it over the winter months, to read surfaces without drowning in sensation, to set boundaries so that every object I touched didn't crack open my skull with its history. But the ley line stones were different. They held magical history the way most objects held human emotion. They held centuries, centuries of working, centuries of practitioners coming to this place, centuries of the town's magical rhythm being anchored and adjusted here by hands and minds and will. I knelt down and placed my palm against the first exposed stone, moving with careful deliberation. The moment my skin made contact, the sensation rushed in. Images cascaded through me like water. The founding of Crabapple Bend, the first practitioners gathering in secret to establish the binding. The decision to create ward stones in buildings, to establish ley line checkpoints, to create a system of magical containment that would keep the town's extraordinary power manageable. The work was meticulous, intentional, rooted in memory of what happened when magic went unchecked. Blood on stone. People transformed by uncontrolled convergence. Magic consuming those it touched. The casualties had been real. 12 people. I felt their names like a weight. Felt the specific losses that the founders had witnessed and determined would never happen again. Felt the weight of responsibility they'd accepted when they established the binding, not as oppression, but as grief translated into prevention. I pulled my hand back, gasping. My heart was racing. Quill sent concerned feeling bursts from my jacket pocket. Too much? Nolan's voice came from behind me, gentle and quiet. He was in his harbor master gear, monitoring the tide level for safety purposes. The festival required regular checks to make sure the exposed rocks were stable, that no one got stranded in a pool that was filling too quickly, that the magic didn't act up in unexpected ways when concentrated under the pressure of returning water. The history, I said, trying to catch my breath. It's all there. Everything Crabapple Bend built itself on. Every fear, every loss, every decision. Nolan sat beside me on the stone, not touching the ley line markers. He knew better than to interrupt someone in the immediate aftermath of a strong reading. He'd learned that much from watching me navigate Crabapple Bend over these months. Corinne thinks that history is wrong, I said, still recovering. That the binding is limiting the town rather than protecting it. That what the founders built out of fear could be dismantled by people brave enough to accept the risk. Is she wrong? Nolan asked. I considered the question seriously. It deserved serious consideration. Maybe about limiting it. The binding probably does constrain what magic can do here. It probably suppresses potential. But the founders had reasons. They'd seen what happened without constraint. They'd watched people die. Nolan was quiet for a long moment. The water moved below us, the tide turning like something waking. The ocean was magic in its own way, wild, ancient, utterly indifferent to human intention. The binding worked against that kind of force, held it at bay through systematic magical architecture. You think Corinne would have been proven right eventually? Nolan asked. If we just let her complete what she started? No, I said. I think she would have destroyed this place. And maybe that was her intention. Maybe she was never trying to improve Crabapple Bend. Maybe she was trying to weaponize it. To remove the constraints and let the magic go wild so that the anti-binding network could harvest it, weaponize it, use it. Then we stop her, Nolan said simply. How? She's gone. She's had months to prepare her exit strategy. She has funding, connections, training. We have suspicions and psychometric readings. Nolan took my hand. It was becoming easier to do that, to reach for each other without overthinking it. We find her. Even if it takes weeks, even if it takes months, we find her. And if we don't? Then we rebuild the ward stones. We repair the binding. We make this place as strong as it can be without her. I leaned against him, feeling the solid weight of his presence, the particular steadiness that came from someone connected to water magic, fluid but constant, moving but grounded. The festival continued around us. People walked the tide pools, tourists took photographs. The town breathed. But underneath it all, something fundamental was breaking. The binding was wounded, and we didn't know how much longer we had before it failed completely. We sat watching the tide return, watching the ley line stones disappear back into the water, watching the magical landscape of Crabapple Bend settle back into its hidden configuration. The day was sliding toward evening. The festival booths in the distance were beginning to close down. People were moving toward dinner and rest, moving toward the ordinary rhythms of life continuing. We'll figure this out, Nolan said finally. I wanted to believe him. I was learning that sometimes faith in someone else's certainty was enough to make your own doubts bearable. After he left, reluctantly, called back to the harbor to check water levels and ensure the tide was behaving as expected, I walked to Petrichor Coffee. B was closing up, wiping down tables and putting chairs up on surfaces in that end-of-day ritual that all small business owners performed. Rough day? She asked, not bothering with a greeting. Complicated day, I said. I touched the ley line stones and saw the history of the binding, felt how much work went into creating the system, how much sacrifice. And now Corinne's trying to tear it all down. B made me a drink, something off menu, something warm and comforting that tasted of honey and cinnamon and her particular brand of care. She handed it to me without charge. The binding will hold, she said, with the kind of confidence that came from someone who'd lived in this town long enough to understand its deeper structures. Not because it's perfect, but because the people who care about it are committed to defending it. You're one of those people now. I held the warmth of the drink in my hands and let her words settle. Maybe that was enough. Not certainty, but commitment. Not victory, but determination to keep fighting. Chapter 11. The Evidence Trail. Restrepo worked like someone solving a puzzle where all the pieces had to fit perfectly, or she'd lose the entire case. She had 3 days to build something solid enough to move toward arrest, and she was using every hour methodically. She showed me the fingerprint results the following morning, spreading photographs across her desk with careful precision, every detail exactly positioned. Ceramic pots from the poison garden, she said. 3 of them have clear prints, all Corinne Vidal, lifted from the edges where someone would naturally grip them. The pots themselves were unremarkable, standard gardening ceramic, the kind you could buy at any hardware store in the region. But what made them significant was location and arrangement. They'd been placed in a specific pattern near the tide pool stairs ley line, positioned to cultivate plants that no legitimate gardener would grow, especially not on this scale, especially not with this precise intention. Nightshade, Restrepo continued, pointing to botanical photographs. Foxglove, oleander, monkshood, specific plants chosen for their cardiac effects. Combined in a particular way, macerated together, they create a poison that mimics natural heart failure so perfectly that without forensic testing, it would read as simple cardiac arrest. How did she prepare it? I asked. According to the forensic botanist, we brought in a specialist from the state. You'd need to macerate the plants, then reduce the liquid over specific heat to concentrate the toxins to lethal potency. It's not something you do casually. It requires knowledge, precision, intent. Restrepo paused, letting that sink in. It requires someone who studied poison, deliberately, with purpose. Does Corinne have that background? Her family line includes several practitioners, Restrepo said, consulting her notes. Her grandmother was registered with the Binding Authority in 1967, specialized in herbalism, legitimate herbalism, documented through official channels, all of it perfectly legal. None of it openly about poison, but the knowledge base would certainly be there, and family knowledge passes down. I thought about what I'd sensed from the thermos, the manicured hands, the precision of measurement, the complete absence of hesitation. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had made peace with the decision to do it before she ever began. The DNA evidence, I said. Confirms it completely, Restrepo said. Her genetic material is on the plants themselves. She didn't just handle the pots. She worked with the plants directly. She cultivated them, selected them, prepared them. This is hands-on preparation, not someone delegating the work to an assistant. But the most interesting piece came when Desmond appeared at the Fossick 3 days later, with Oracle tucked under his arm like a weathered handbag, and a stack of historical documents that he spread across my counter with reverence. The anti-binding movement didn't start with Miriam Goss, he said. It goes back generations. Look, 1923, 1950s, 1980s. Every single time the binding gets stronger, every time the town implements new safety measures, there's a counter-movement. Practitioners who believe the magical world shouldn't be constrained by safety measures, who think the binding is artificial. I read through the documents, my hands touching the aged paper gently. Names, dates, philosophical arguments preserved in precise handwriting. The anti-binding practitioners consistently argued that the binding system was artificial, limiting, a cage built by the fearful on top of the exceptional. They talked about liberation, about what magic could accomplish if given freedom, about the town's potential being squandered in service to fear, about the tragedy of magic restrained. Corinne's family has always been part of this, Desmond said, pointing to specific names with the precision of someone who'd researched thoroughly. Her grandmother wasn't just an herbalist. She was an early member of the anti-binding network. That knowledge got passed down through the family line, ideology as inheritance, philosophy as DNA. The pattern became clearer as I read. Each generation of anti-binding practitioners passed their convictions to the next. Each believed they were on the right side of history. Each was certain that the binding was wrong and that removing it was justified. Each was willing to sacrifice something, or someone, to achieve their vision. So she's not just a criminal, I said slowly, understanding the implications. She's an ideologue. Worse, Desmond said. She's a true believer. She genuinely thinks she's right, that the binding is wrong, that removing Aldous Fenn, removing anyone who stands in the way of the binding's dissolution, is justified by the greater good she's pursuing. That realization was chilling in ways that fingerprint evidence couldn't convey. It was the difference between a person committing a crime and a person committing a murder as an act of conscience. Then there was the matter of the health board complaints. I discovered it by accident when Patrice came by the Fossick with official documents showing that Corinne had filed a formal complaint against my apothecary license, claiming that my remedies were unlicensed, unverified, and potentially dangerous to the town's residents. It was designed to look legitimate, grounded in actual regulatory language and apparent concern, but the intent was transparent once you knew to look for it. She was trying to destroy me through bureaucracy. She wanted to discredit you, Patrice explained. If she could get your apothecary section shut down, she'd eliminate your standing in the community, make you seem like someone who was breaking rules, operating without proper authorization. It's personal, I said. It's strategic, Patrice corrected gently. But yes, also personal. You're investigating her. You're the one person who can read her emotional signature through objects she's touched. You're a threat to her in a way that nobody else in this town is. She wanted to neutralize you. The evidence kept accumulating. Property acquisition patterns spanning 3 years. Financial connections to Miriam Goss and practitioners in other coastal towns. Fingerprints on garden pots. DNA on cultivated plants. Toxicological analysis of poison components matching the thermos contents. Psychometric readings showing her hands, her intention, her specific knowledge. By the time Restrepo had assembled everything, it was comprehensive in a way that left no reasonable doubt. Corinne Vidal had killed Aldous Fenn. And she'd done it with full knowledge of what she was doing, with complete conviction that she was right. That was the scariest part of all. I walked home from Restrepo's office as evening settled over Crabapple Bend. The streets were quieter now, the festival having officially ended. The booths were dismantled, the decorations were stored away. The magic was settling back into its normal patterns. But the town felt different to me, more fragile, more dependent on systems that most people never thought about. At the Fossick, I made dinner, just something simple. Soup from a mix because I couldn't focus enough to cook properly. Quill ate his hedgehog food while I sat with my soup, thinking about Corinne's conviction. About how someone could decide that their vision for the future justified the death of someone in the present. B had texted me, "Thinking of you. The town will stand with you." Simple words, but they mattered. They reminded me that I wasn't fighting this alone, that the community had built itself over generations on foundations that mattered, and they weren't going to let those foundations crumble without a fight. Chapter 12. Connections. I spent a full day at Restrepo's office laying out the evidence methodically, organizing it the way I once organized financial audits for corporate boards. Not for emotional impact or dramatic revelation, but for logical comprehensiveness and undeniable weight. Every connection charted, every piece of evidence in its proper sequence, the narrative that emerged from data alone, without interpretation or editorializing, was damning. Property acquisitions, I said, pointing to the detailed map I'd created. 5 properties in Crabapple Bend with documented wardstones. She owns 3 outright, acquired over the past 2 years at prices significantly above market value. She made formal offers on 2 others that were blocked by the Historical Preservation Committee. Restrepo studied the map methodically. The pattern was clear once you understood what you were looking at. Every single one of those properties was on a documented ley line or in close proximity to significant magical architecture. Every one was foundational to the binding system. The rejections, I continued. Both happened in the past 6 months. Both rejections came with Aldous Fenn's direct opposition. He voted against the sales at committee meetings. He documented extensively why he thought preserving the wardstones was essential to the town's magical infrastructure. He was specifically blocking her, Restrepo said. Deliberately. Deliberately, I confirmed. And she knew it. There's no other reason to target him, to eliminate him, unless he was actively interfering with her plans. He was an obstacle to her vision. Next, the financial connections. Miriam Goss, I said, showing the bank records Patrice had uncovered through meticulous research. Deceased, but before her death 6 years ago, she transferred significant funds to practitioners in other coastal towns. Similar pattern of property acquisition in those towns. Similar targeting of buildings with historical magical significance. Network, Restrepo said. Coordinated network, I agreed. At least 5 documented convergence points across the coast, all experiencing simultaneous acquisition attempts, all attempting to target properties with foundational binding architecture, all connected to Corinne through financial records. The transfers are documented. The connections are clear. They're trying to dismantle the binding system, Restrepo said slowly, understanding the scope of what she was looking at. By removing the infrastructure that supports it, I said. If they can demolish or significantly alter enough Wardstone buildings across different coastal towns, the entire interconnected system becomes vulnerable. The binding depends on geographical distribution, on those specific buildings maintaining their structure. Remove enough of them, and the whole system fails. The botanical evidence came next. The poison garden photographs, the soil composition analysis, the specific plants arranged in a pattern that suggested magical intent, not casual gardening or herbalism for legitimate purposes. This garden was cultivated specifically near the tide pool stairs ley line, I said. According to the forensic botanist, the proximity to the ley line would amplify the magical potency of the plants. The poison would be stronger, more concentrated, more reliably fatal. She didn't just know herbalism. She knew how to weaponize it using the town's magical infrastructure. She wasn't just killing him, Restrepo said slowly. She was making sure it worked. Making sure there was no possibility of survival, no chance of accidental recovery. Precisely, I said. The manicured hands I sensed through the thermos, those belonged to someone with knowledge, precision, and absolute confidence in their methodology. This wasn't a moment of rage or passion. This was deliberate poisoning by someone who'd learned exactly how to weaponize herbalism, who'd prepared methodically, who'd chosen the method deliberately. Then the final piece, the thermos itself. My psychometric reading shows her hands, her knowledge, her specific intention in the preparation, I explained. The forensic evidence confirms trace magical residue matching Corinne's unique signature on the thermos interior. The conventional fingerprint evidence from the thermos handle is inconclusive. She wore gloves when handling it, and the gloves protected against leaving clear prints. But the magical residue is unmistakable. It's her. Will that be admissible in court? Restrepo asked. In Crabapple Bend, yes, I said. That was established in the jurisdiction during previous investigations. The town's legal system recognizes magical forensic evidence in cases where conventional evidence would be insufficient. This case qualifies. Fingerprints failed because of the gloves, but magical signature is as unique as DNA. Doesn't lie. Finally, I showed Restrepo Aldous Fenn's personal maps and notes. His documentation of the town's binding architecture, his precise understanding of how the system worked, his deep personal conviction that the Wardstone buildings were essential to the town's survival. He was the binding's custodian, I said. Not officially, but in practice. He understood the system better than anyone currently on the Preservation Committee. That made him invaluable, and made him an obstacle to anyone who wanted to dismantle it. Motive means an opportunity, Restrepo said, looking up from the evidence. All 3, I confirmed. Corinne had financial incentive to remove him. She had the knowledge to poison him effectively. She had the access and timing to place the thermos in the brackenwood. She was the one who did this. Restrepo sat back in her chair. For a long moment, she just looked at all the evidence spread across her desk. Photographs, documents, handwriting samples, maps, charts. The comprehensive picture of a crime planned methodically and executed deliberately. "This is good," she said finally. "This is solid. The conventional evidence might hold up on its own. The fingerprints, the DNA, the financial records. The magical evidence definitely supports it. Together, we have a case that can survive scrutiny and conviction." "When will you arrest her?" I asked. "Soon," Restrepo said. "I want to be absolutely certain before I move. I want to have every piece in place. But we're there. We have what we need." I thought about Corinne, moving through Crabapple Bend with her quiet conviction and absolute certainty. Believing she was right. Believing the binding was wrong. Believing her actions were justified by the larger cause she served. That was the thing about people who genuinely believed in their cause. They were terrifying not because they were crazy, but because they were absolutely, completely sane. They'd made their calculations. They'd accepted their conclusions. They'd made peace with what they'd done. That was what made them most dangerous of all. I walked home through the quiet streets of Crabapple Bend, processing everything. The town around me was peaceful, ordinary, unaware that one of its members had murdered another based on philosophical conviction. The ordinary people, tourists heading back to hotels, locals closing their shops, families preparing evening meals, had no idea how close they'd come to losing someone essential. B texted me as I walked. "Tea at my place tomorrow? Need to recover." "Yes," I texted back. "Definitely yes." Because that was how you survived this kind of knowledge. You drank tea with people who understood. You let the community hold you up. You accepted that some burdens were too heavy to carry alone. Chapter 13. Dark Moment. Corinne found me at the Fossick on a Tuesday afternoon, when I was alone in the apothecary section, organizing tinctures by color and potency. She moved through the shop with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd been here 100 times, or that she didn't care whether she'd been here at all. Confidence in belonging or confidence in irrelevance. I couldn't quite tell which. She examined a shelf of dried herbs, touching the labels with those manicured fingers. "Your work is impressive. You've learned the town quickly, integrated yourself effectively. You're not someone who gives up on things." "Can I help you with something?" I asked, not bothering with false pleasantness or the pretense that this was a normal customer visit. "I came to talk philosophy," Corinne said, "because I think you're too intelligent to refuse the conversation, too thoughtful, too honest." I set down the tincture bottle I was holding and turned to face her directly. Up close, she was exactly what my psychometric reading had suggested. Composed, precise, certain of her rightness. Manicured nails without a chip, clothing that suggested wealth and meticulous maintenance. Eyes that assessed everything with cool, professional calculation. "The binding is a cage," she said quietly. "You know this as well as I do. You've felt the ley lines moving through the town. You've experienced the magical depth here, the way power moves beneath the surface of ordinary life. Imagine what Crabapple Bend could be if it wasn't constrained by outdated safety measures, by fear dressed up as protection. Constrained by measures that prevented the deaths of innocent people," I said. 12 deaths, Corinne said dismissively. "Against a century of limitations, against the magical potential that's been systematically suppressed in this place. There's a cost to everything, Teddy. The question isn't whether to pay a cost. The question is whether the cost is worth the benefit. It's not your cost, I said. You're not the one who has to live with the consequences if the binding fails. We all live with consequences, Corinne said. The consequence of safety is stagnation. The consequence of caution is weakness. This town could be extraordinary if someone had the courage to admit that the old system is obsolete, if someone could look beyond fear. I thought about Aldous Fenn, drinking poison tea in a sealed clearing where nobody could hear him. About Tamsin, inheriting responsibility and grief she'd never wanted. About the town's ordinary people who relied on the binding to keep them safe from magical forces they couldn't understand or control. You killed him, I said quietly. For just a moment, Corinne's expression flickered. The facade cracked just barely, and I saw something underneath. Not guilt, not regret. Just a moment where she allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd done. Then it settled back into composure. Aldous Fenn was committed to a dying system, she said. He was willing to use his position to block progress, willing to preserve a cage and call it protection. He made a choice to stand against the inevitable. I simply made sure he couldn't persist in that choice. That's not murder, Teddy. That's removing an obstacle. You poisoned him, I said. I removed an obstacle, Corinne corrected firmly. The binding is weakening regardless. You know it. I know it. The question isn't whether the binding will fail. The question is who guides that failure. The people who want to manage the transition thoughtfully, or the people who panic when it collapses on its own. She stepped closer. Her perfume was expensive and precise, exactly like everything about her. It didn't change, didn't waver, stayed perfectly composed. Join us, she said. You're too valuable to waste on the losing side. You can sense what the town is becoming. Help us ensure that transformation is controlled. Help us be ready when the binding finally breaks. You don't have to be on the wrong side of history. No, I said. You should reconsider, Corinne said. People who stand with the binding when it falls will be remembered as obstacles to progress. That's not a comfortable legacy. That's not how you want to be remembered in this town you've grown to love. She left without waiting for another response. Just turned and walked out of the Fossick, moving with absolute certainty, leaving me standing among the tinctures and dried herbs, my hands shaking. Quill emerged from the back room, bristled and furious. The hedgehog's feeling bursts came in sharp, angry spikes that felt like electricity. Danger, threat, wrong. All of it directed at Corinne's absence, at what she represented. I sat down heavily on the stool behind the counter. What if she was right? The thought came unbidden, unwelcome, but persistent in a way I couldn't dismiss. The binding had been established by frightened people, making decisions based on tragedy. The magical world had evolved in the centuries since then. Maybe the system was outdated. Maybe the limitations did suppress something valuable. Maybe the town was being held back by a cage built by the dead. If the binding was a cage, didn't that make it wrong? Didn't progress require the willingness to take risks? Didn't the magical world deserve freedom? But then I thought about Aldous Fenn. Not as an obstacle to progress, but as a person. Someone who'd understood the town's magical system deeply. Someone who dedicated himself to preservation not from fear, but from conviction that the work mattered. Someone who'd been poisoned for the crime of believing in something different. That thought dissolved the doubt like fog burned away by morning sun. Clarity, sudden and absolute. Fenn wasn't wrong because he stood against change. He wasn't wrong because he supported the binding. He was murdered by someone who decided that her philosophy was more important than his life, that her vision of progress justified his death. That was the core of it. That was the thing that made Corinne's certainty so terrifying. She wasn't just wrong about the binding. She was wrong about the value of individual choice, wrong about the right to decide other people's fates based on your beliefs about the future, wrong about what justified murder, wrong in a way that required stopping. I made tea with careful attention to detail. Quill settled on my lap, sending waves of approval and vindication. The shop's familiar reassurance folded around me like a blanket, like home. By evening, I knew what I had to do. I called Restrepo and asked her to meet me at the Fossick. When she arrived, I laid out everything I'd been thinking: the psychometric readings, the evidence of Corinne's hands on the thermos, the specific knowledge required to create that poison. I showed her the financial records Desmond had compiled. I explained how the property acquisitions aligned with Wardstone locations. "It's her," I said simply. "Corinne Vidal murdered Aldous Fenn because he stood in the way of her plan to dismantle the binding. And she did it deliberately, with full knowledge of what she was doing, with complete conviction that she was right." Restrepo listened intently, taking notes, asking sharp questions. When I finished, she sat back and nodded. "I believe you," she said, "and I think you're right. We're going to need physical evidence, legal evidence, something that will hold up in court. But I believe what you're telling me." "So what do we do?" I asked. "We build the case methodically. We gather evidence. We make sure everything is documented and undeniable. And then we arrest her." It sounded simple when you said it that way. But simple and easy were very different things. Simple meant clear. Easy meant quick. This would be neither. Chapter 14. The Arrest. Restrepo scheduled the confrontation for late afternoon in the Grange Hall committee room, the same room where Aldous Fenn had sat 2 weeks before and unknowingly drank poison from his thermos. There was a kind of narrative logic to using that space, a way of closing the circle, of containing this moment within the boundary of consequence. Corinne agreed to come voluntarily. Of course she had. Arresting her without giving her the opportunity to appear cooperative would undermine the professional courtesy she valued, would suggest doubt about her righteousness. She arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed, her demeanor suggesting she was attending a business meeting rather than a police interview about the murder of Aldous Fenn. I was there with Restrepo, along with Patrice, who documented the financial evidence with meticulous care, and the forensic specialist who'd processed the botanical samples. We arranged ourselves across the table from Corinne in a formation that was deliberately composed, not threatening, but authoritative. The arrangement of power made visible through position. "Thank you for coming," Restrepo said with formal courtesy. "Of course," Corinne replied. "I assume this is about the complaint Teddy's been making regarding my property acquisition, or perhaps the health board issue." I took that as my cue and began laying out the evidence methodically. No emotion, just facts arranged in logical sequence the way I'd once presented financial audits to corporate boards that wanted to know whether they were solvent or facing collapse. "Building acquisition pattern," I said, showing the detailed map. 5 properties in Crabapple Bend with documented wardstones. 3 of them in your name or in shell companies you control. 2 of them you made offers on that were blocked by the Historical Preservation Committee. Corinne watched calmly, unsurprised. Her composure suggested she'd expected this conversation all along, had anticipated this moment with the same cool calculation she applied to everything else. "Financial connections," I continued, presenting the bank records. To Miriam Goss, deceased, and to practitioners in other coastal towns, all engaged in similar acquisition patterns, all building a network that spans at least 5 documented convergence points along the coast. All trying to free trapped magic, Corinne said quietly. All trying to destroy the binding systems that keep those convergence points manageable, I corrected. Moving to the botanical evidence. A poison garden cultivated specifically near the tide pool stairs ley line. Plants selected and arranged to create a specific herbal combination that mimics cardiac arrest without leaving forensic markers. The forensic specialist stepped in, showing enlarged photographs of the garden, the ceramic pots, the arrangement of plants in precise rows. The meticulous care with which each element had been positioned, labeled, maintained. We found your fingerprints on the ceramic pot edges, the specialist said. Your magical signature matches the soil composition. Your DNA is on the plants themselves. The work is yours. For the first time, I saw something flicker across Corinne's expression. Not fear, she was too controlled for that, but something like recognition that the game had shifted fundamentally, from philosophical debate to legal consequence. I have no proof I cultivated that garden, Corinne said defensively. You do, Restrepo interjected. Your fingerprints are on the ceramic pot edges. Your magical signature matches the soil composition, and your DNA is on the plants themselves. The evidence is comprehensive. The thermos, I said. Aldous Fenn's thermos, found at the Brackenwood crime scene. My psychometric reading shows your hands, your knowledge, your specific intention in the preparation of the poison. And the forensic evidence confirms trace magical residue matching your unique signature. Magical evidence isn't admissible in court, Corinne said, testing this boundary. It is in Crabapple Bend, Restrepo said. In consultation with the town's practitioners and our local prosecutor, we've established admissibility for magical forensic evidence in cases where conventional evidence would be insufficient. Your case is exactly that. We have enough conventional evidence to proceed. The magical evidence is corroboration. I finished with the final piece. The historical records showing Fenn's knowledge of the binding architecture, his personal maps, his documented opposition to Corinne's property acquisitions. His intention to protect the Wardstone buildings, I said. Your deliberate targeting of him as an obstacle to your plan. That's motive. The poison knowledge and the garden, that's means. The access, the timing, the placement of the thermos in the Brackenwood, that's opportunity. Motive, means, and opportunity. That's guilt. For a long moment, Corinne didn't speak. She looked at each of us in turn, methodically, deliberately, as though committing our faces to memory. Then she smiled. That same terrible smile I'd sensed in her chair at the committee meeting. The smile of someone who'd decided something irreversible and was at peace with it. The binding is a cage, she said, and I'm right about that. This town could be so much more without it. The magic here is extraordinary. Imagine if we let it flourish without constraints. Imagine what Crabapple Bend could become. Uncontrollable, I said. Dangerous. Destructive. 12 people died in the last convergence event before the binding was created. That's why it exists. Not from fear, from learning. Progress requires sacrifice, Corinne said. Not my sacrifice, I said. Not the town's sacrifice. Not anyone's sacrifice without their consent. Restrepo placed the arrest warrant on the table. The document was straightforward, legal, absolute. Corinne Vidal, murder in the first degree. Aldous Fenn, spring of 2026. Corinne Vidal, Restrepo said formally. You're under arrest for the murder of Aldous Fenn. The arrest was clean, professional. Corinne didn't resist. She stood with deliberate grace and extended her wrists for the handcuffs, still smiling that terrible smile. "The binding is weakening regardless," she said as Restrepo led her away. "You stopped me, but you haven't stopped the inevitable. And when it fails, and it will, remember that I tried to make the transition controlled. The next person might not be as thoughtful. The next person might not believe in managed change." After she left, the room felt very quiet. I stood among the evidence charts and photographs and maps, feeling the weight of what we'd accomplished and what still needed to be done. Fenn's murder was solved, the immediate threat was contained, but the larger problem remained. The binding was still weakening. Corinne's arrest wouldn't stop that, and the spring renewal ceremony, just weeks away, would reveal exactly how much damage had already been done to the system that Aldous had died protecting. Nolan found me afterward as the arrest paperwork was being processed and Restrepo was coordinating with state police about the larger anti-binding network. He didn't say anything, just handed me a coffee from Petrichor. B had sent it, he said. My best friend thinking of me even as everything was happening. We sat in the Grange Hall's back room, surrounded by the apparatus of justice, filing cabinets, evidence boxes, the machinery of making sure that consequences followed actions. Outside, the town was continuing its evening routines, most people unaware that a murderer had just been arrested, that the safety they'd taken for granted was more fragile than they knew. "We did it," Nolan said finally. "We caught one criminal," I corrected. "We haven't fixed what she damaged. We haven't stopped the network that sent her. We haven't solved the larger problem." "No," Nolan agreed. "But we took one piece off the board. That's how you win. One piece at a time. One problem at a time. One day at a time." I wanted to believe that. I was learning, slowly, that sometimes belief was a choice you made because the alternative was despair. Chapter 15. Aftermath. The Tide Pool Festival dismantled itself over 3 days. The booths came down, their temporary structures revealing bare ground underneath. The lights were methodically stored in boxes marked with the year. The decorations, the streamers and banners and festival ephemera, were packed away for another year, waiting in storage for the next spring. It was bittersweet work, the celebration ending, but the certainty of next year's festival providing a kind of continuity. The rhythm of seasons, the promise of return. Floyd appeared in my shop 2 days after Corinne's arrest, looking like someone who'd been living underwater and had just learned to breathe air again. He moved gently, as though testing whether this new version of reality was stable. "I don't understand," he said to me, not bothering with greetings or pretense. "Corinne and I have disagreed on everything for 30 years. Everything. Every decision at the committee, every proposal, every vision for the town's direction. But I would never have guessed she'd actually kill him. I would have sworn she wasn't capable of that." "She believed she was right," I said thoughtfully. "That matters sometimes. It matters more than capability or decency." Floyd nodded slowly, digesting this with the gravity it deserved. "He was a good man, Aldous was. We fought like cats and dogs, but he cared about the town. He cared about doing things properly, about maintaining the system that protected us. That's worth something." "It is," I said. "I'm going to miss him," Floyd said. "Even though I also spent 15 years wanting him to retire and let me do my job." He left without ordering anything, and I didn't think he'd really come for supplies. He'd come to process something that couldn't be processed any other way. To stand in a place where the investigation had unfolded and accept that someone he'd known for decades had committed murder. That professional disagreement was different from personal betrayal. that you could fight with someone and still respect them. That death made all those fights seem small. Tamsin took over Aldous Fenn's position on the Preservation Committee, not elected formally, but stepping into it with the weight of necessity. I encountered her at the Grange Hall when I came to give my formal statement to Restrepo, and she looked approximately how Floyd had felt. Overwhelmed, uncertain, but committed to the work. "I didn't want this," she said to me in the hallway. "I wanted to be his assistant. I wanted to learn from him gradually, to have years to understand how everything worked. Now I'm supposed to know it all immediately." "You know more than you think," I said. "You've been paying attention, and the town will help you." "Will they?" Tamsin asked. Because Corinne was right about one thing. The binding is weakening. Aldous knew it. I'm just now starting to understand the scope of it. What am I supposed to do against something that big? How do I protect a system that's falling apart from within? "The same thing Aldous did," I said. "Show up. Do the work. Protect what matters. One decision at a time. Don't try to solve the whole problem, just the one in front of you." By the end of the week, the Wardstone buildings received official magical ordinance protection, not just by Preservation Committee decree, but by formal town law, recorded and binding. The buildings couldn't be demolished. They couldn't be substantially altered. They could be maintained and restored with reverence, but their essential structure and foundation had to remain intact, unchanged, protected. It was the right decision. It was also a burden that Tamsin carried with quiet determination. The Brackenwood moved back to its normal boundaries. The forest released its protective stance now that the immediate danger had passed. The fog returned to its proper cycle, arriving with the evening and departing with the dawn. The town's magical ecosystem settled back to its baseline, tired, exhausted, but stable. Bee came by the Fossick with confetti and a kind of knowing calm that suggested she understood something about what had happened without needing the full explanation. She'd been in Crabapple Bend long enough to recognize the weight of solved mysteries, the way closure looks when it's finally achieved. "You did it," Bee said, setting down her offering, a tray of cookies that still radiated warmth from her oven, cinnamon and honey and care. "You figured out who killed Fenn and protected the town." "We did," I said. "The community did. Desmond with his historical research and knowledge of the town's past, Patrice with the financial records and meticulous documentation that connected everything, Restrepo with the investigation and professional expertise that made it all legal, Nolan with—" I paused, uncertain how to describe what Nolan had done. "With being present, with believing in me when I wasn't sure I could do this." "And you with your ability," Bee said firmly. "You're the one who knew. You're the one who could read the evidence that nobody else could access. You're the one who saw through everything to the truth beneath the surface." I thought about that as we made tea together, as we settled into the familiar rhythm of serving each other comfort. The ability had been frightening at first, overwhelming. Now it felt like part of who I was, part of what I could offer Crabapple Bend. We sat together while the sun set, making tea, talking about the festival and the investigation, and the weight of knowing the town's darker secrets. Outside, ordinary people were moving through ordinary lives, blissfully unaware that magic was weakening and philosophy was becoming lethal. Blissfully unaware that they'd been close to losing their home. Desmond visited with Oracle tucked under his arm like a weathered handbag, who settled on the shop's counter with her ancient eyes fixed on me. The message came through Oracle clearly. The keeper of walls became the wall. The wall must stand. "We understand," I told the tortoise. "The binding is safe for now. The Wardstones are protected. We'll keep watch." "Miriam's network won't disappear," Desmond said. There will be others. There will be more attempts. I know, I said, but not today. Today, we rest. And for a moment, just a moment, I believed it was true. Chapter 16. Rooted. Spring settled over Crabapple Bend the way it always did, gradually, then suddenly, then completely. The crabapple tree, having shed every one of its blossoms overnight in the hours after Corinne's arrest, began putting out new leaves, green, tender, vulnerable, reaching for the sun. A promise of continuity, a promise that things grow and change and return. I walked with Nolan through the festival grounds as they were being systematically taken down. The booths were being dismantled methodically, the lights wound up and placed in labeled boxes, the decorations stored away for another year. It was bittersweet work, the celebration ending, but the certainty of next year's festival providing a kind of continuity. The rhythm of town life reasserting itself. Thank you, Nolan said as we walked, for what you did, for what you figured out. I did my job, I said. You did more than that. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with care. You stayed. When you could have left, when Corinne was attacking you through the health board, when everything was uncertain, when your investigation was making you a target, you stayed. I wanted to, I said. Stay, I mean. I realized somewhere in the middle of all this that staying was what I wanted. We walked past the tide pool stairs, where the spring tide was beginning its eternal rhythm, the water moving in patterns established long before Crabapple Bend existed. The rocks were being methodically cleared now that the festival was over, the magical energy settling back to normal. The rhythm of the ocean, indifferent to human concerns, continuing regardless of murder and investigation. Nolan reached for my hand. Just took it. The way someone picks up something that belongs to them. His fingers were warm, slightly roughened from years of working with boats and ropes. Absolutely real in a way that grounded me. I was going to wait, he said. Give you time. Let things develop naturally. But Corinne's actions forced acceleration, and I realized I don't want to wait anymore. Life's too uncertain for that. Nolan, I said. You don't have to say anything, he said. I'm just telling you that I'm here, that I want to be here, that if you're willing, I'd like to try something with you that goes beyond coffee meetings and committee work. Something real. I'm willing, I said. Simple, true, terrifying in its certainty. We walked like that for a while, hand in hand, not talking, just being present in the same space, acknowledging that something had shifted. Not resolved, too complicated for that, but shifted, moving forward into something neither of us could predict. Quill, perched in my jacket pocket, sent me waves of absolutely smug satisfaction. The hedgehog's feeling bursts carried something almost triumphant. Mealworms would definitely be forthcoming, I knew, as reward for competent romantic execution. That evening, back at the Fossick, Bee came by with confetti. My best friend appeared to understand something profound because she smiled and didn't ask questions. Instead, she made tea and sat with me while the sun set, and we watched the fog arrive with the evening. On schedule, reliable. You did it, Bee said. You solved Fenn's death and saved the binding. We solved it, I said. All of us. The town solved it by being exactly what I needed. And Nolan? Bee asked, with a kind of deliberate casualness that fooled no one. Ask me in a few weeks, I said. We're still figuring it out, still learning whether this works. Desmond visited later, with Oracle tucked under his arm, who settled on the shop's counter with her ancient eyes fixed on me. The message came through Oracle with perfect clarity. The keeper of walls became the wall. The wall must stand. We understand, I told the tortoise. The binding is safe for now. The ward stones are protected. We'll keep watch. Miriam's network won't disappear, Desmond said with certainty. There will be others. There will be more attempts. I know, I said, but not today. Today, we rest. That night, I found a note slipped under the Fossick's door, unsigned. Just 5 words written in a hand I didn't recognize. The binding must not hold. I read it 3 times, letting the implication settle. Then I showed it to Nolan when he appeared the next morning with coffee and that particular expression that suggested he'd woken early to get my order exactly right. Extra foam, the way I like it. Someone else, he said, reading the note with sharp attention. Someone connected to Corinne's network, or someone with their own agenda. Someone who believes what she believed. Later, I said. We'll deal with it later. Right now, I just want to have a normal day. Serve customers, make tea. Be a person in a shop who isn't investigating murders or fighting to protect her town. You'll never be just a person in a shop, Nolan said gently. You're more than that. You know that, right? Maybe, I said, but I can try. Outside, the crabapple tree stood in the town square, bare of blossoms but full of promise. Its branches were waiting for next season, for the next significant event, for the next moment when Crabapple Bend would need protection. The tree had survived 150 years of events, both magical and mundane, seasons turning, challenges rising and falling, the town continuing. I'd survived 6 months. From autumn arrival to spring investigation to hand-holding in the afternoon, from uncertainty to rooted purpose. The tree stood waiting. So did I. Rooted now, not by accident, but by choice. By the deliberate decision to stay in this place where magic was real, and the work mattered, and the community had learned to trust me with their secrets. In my jacket, Quill settled into sleep, sending final contentment across our bond. The shop was warm, the tea was hot, the town was moving forward, and somewhere in Crabapple Bend, spring was blooming despite everything. For now, that was enough.
Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review.